Hello, Cornerstone and friends. My name is Reverend Roy, and welcome to another deck discussion. Today we have with us Magrey, Reverend Magrey deVega from Hyde Park United Methodist Church, and another one of my covenant brothers, which you all have been hearing recently. And so we're excited to have you with us, Magrey.
Hey, brother, good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Good to have you. I start this out with the same question for everybody, and that is, where did we meet, or how did we meet?
Wow. Well, so I've been a fan of yours for a long time. I've admired you from a distance, especially when I was up in Iowa. I continued to hear from other colleagues about the great work that Cornerstone was doing and the amazing, profound, prophetic work that you do, particularly in the areas of justice and equality and the Immokalee workers. I think that may be the first time I saw you from a distance was at annual conference when you were speaking on that position, and it was just a powerful witness. And back then, a minority witness in the conference, if I remember correctly. And then over time, just the amazing work you all do with environmental justice and inclusion. And just so many people over the years have said, do you know Roy Terry? Do you know Roy Terry? And so I've known of you, but I think it really wasn't until that trip to Northern Ireland when many of members of our covenant group and a whole bunch of others went over there to Belfast to study peace and nonviolence, that you and I got to know each other better and experienced several stories that, you know, the things that happen in Belfast stay in Belfast. And
That's right.
And I remember that on that trip, you were just so kind and warm and inviting of me personally. It was at the time when I was trying to discern whether to join your covenant group. That I just remember your graciousness was one of those things that I reported back to my therapist shortly after that trip. And she said, well, that might be an indication that that group is a group that you probably need to join. And so it wasn't long after that trip that I said, I'm in. And then, of course, since then, you and I have had wonderful experiences together, including Savannah, a couple of Christmases ago. Again, the stuff that happens in Savannah stays in Savannah.
That's what I was going to say, is you got to cut those stories off. Great.
Yeah.
Can't go much further with those. I was thinking Northern Ireland was a good place for us to connect. I think Savannah, of course, deepened our personal relationship, because when we're in covenant with each other, we're around, but we don't ever spend a lot of time one-on-one. So that was a blessing. And of course, I have heard a million things about Magrey deVega, from everything from Jim Harnish to folks telling me about sermons and this awesome preacher. And then one thing keeps coming back up is something about Dr. Seuss and preaching Seuss poetry, or how do you define that style of preaching?
So back in 1998, for the very first time, I went to Universal Studios in Orlando, the Islands of Adventure, where they have that Dr. Seuss landing. I've been a fan of his and his work for a long time, and so captivated by the world of Dr. Seuss that the very next Christmas, in my first church that I was serving up in Tallahassee, I did a Christmas sermon entirely in rhyme. Not sophisticated rhyme, nowhere going to win a Pulitzer or anything, just couplets, rhyming couplets to tell the Christmas story. And it was fun to do, and the response was positive, to where I started making that a tradition. So every Christmas for like 7 years in a row, I told the Christmas story from a different aspect of a different character. Eventually I ran out of characters and it kind of lost its novelty. So I still do it on occasion, but not as regularly. I've done the Easter story and all that, but it's a full-length sermon. It all rhymes. But my hope is that these are more than just gimmicks. I don't want people walking away thinking that was clever, that was creative. That's not the point of a sermon. You know, cleverness and creativity is not the point of a sermon. You want it to be good news and hope, something provocative and challenging. And I those are my favorite compliments, that it helped me see the story in a new way. So it was fun.
I think you accomplished that, because that's what everybody would tell me, is that it was memorable. They could remember the story because of the way that you put it together. But yeah, there's so much more. You might mention, because I forgot to do this in the introduction, where is Hyde Park?
Yeah. Hyde
Nothing is.
Park, Hyde Park is essentially downtown Tampa. It's right across the Hillsborough River from the main urban core. So Hyde Park is one of those historic neighborhoods that's in South Tampa, basically. So we're right next to downtown and right next to the water. Beautiful area, beautiful property here.
Yeah. So I guess I want to move to the next question, which is the call to ministry question. I kind of preface this by saying I'm not so interested in the God called me in the middle of the night. You know, I mean, I get that. That's a given. God called you. But just share a little bit about what led to the discernment of actually entering into ordained ministry. So people get a kind of understanding of what that was and maybe what the struggle around that was. And
Yeah. So there was certainly that moment, that sense that God was calling me. The clearest I'd ever heard God's voice speaking to me was when I heard the words, "I want you to be a preacher." But I would say that beyond that, the scope of it was a profound and prolonged sense of restlessness, followed by an immediate and sustained sense of peace, which even continues to this day. Even with the challenges, the regular challenges of being a minister, there's still peace at the core. So the period of restlessness was my pursuit of being a doctor. I mean, since fourth grade, I thought I was going to be a doctor. Went to college, pre-med, biology degree, submitted 11 applications for medical school and got 11 rejection letters in the spring of 1994. And that put me in a tailspin because I didn't know that I was supposed to be anything else but that. And so really for the next year, 18 months, there was a profound sense of restlessness that didn't settle until that moment on Paso Grill Beach. You and the other Covenant brothers were with me in that, for me, a very sacred spot where I did feel that sense that God was calling me to be a preacher. My biggest hesitation was telling my parents later that night that I wasn't going to be a doctor like they had hoped or that I had hoped, but that I was going to be a minister. And the first confirmation that this was the right call was when my parents said to me that night, "We knew this all along."
wow.
I wish you had told me this. And ever since then, they've been my biggest cheerleaders. So, what's that quote from Augustine? Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That's been true often in my life, but no more profoundly than, when I felt that call.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I literally was, we all stood in the spot.
Yeah.
Magrey actually heard the voice of God. I mean, you have a location you can continue to go back to what you do, right?
I often do. In fact, it is almost a mystical kind of experience. I think we all have those thin spaces, as the Celtic spirituality say, and this is one of them for me. So when I'm really wrestling over a tough ministry decision, or when I'm having to write what I think is a high stakes sermon or another book, and I'm stuck, I will literally take my beach chair and my laptop and go to that spot early in the morning before anybody else gets there. Not recently, obviously, but when I go there, by the time I'm done in a couple hours, there's some fresh insight that gets me over the hump. I'm not a superstitious person, but I think being a spiritual person allows for those kinds of mystical experiences, and that for me is one of them. So
I think that's extremely helpful, especially when people are trying to get a grasp of what does it mean to be a spiritual person. They usually tend to think of the overly dramatic or the sentimental, or that like every time you have a spiritual moment, there's some kind of feeling. I mean, there's feeling, I guess, connected with those thin spaces, but to know that you can just find space that provides you with a place to connect in a different way with God, I think that's a helpful word.
I think what makes those thin spaces so thin, for me, not for everybody necessarily, is that I'm allowed to release my expectations. I think the moment that I start treating a space like that or a ritual like that with an expectation that something will happen is the moment that I turn it into a rabbit's foot or a lucky charm.
Oh, yeah.
And I think for a thin space to be truly spiritually thin, it has to invite you to release your expectations.
Mm.
And in some ways, I hope that's what people experience in worship, in discipleship, in small groups, is that they come in releasing their expectations. And I think that's what the church can be for people.
Yeah. I just had a conversation today with a church member of ours about Richard Rohr.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, one of the beautiful things about Richard Rohr is that he is able to be a deeply contemplative, spiritual person, but doesn't discount science and discovery. And, you know, I think that's the balance sometimes that people get confused about, that somehow you have to be this is one of our favorite movies at the Terry household is Nacho Libre, you know, where
Jack Black, yeah.
Nacho's the religious wrestler, and then his friend Steven calls himself a man of science, you know, that there's either or, but it's not either or, is it? It's
No.
both.
Well, and that's the other part of the genius of Richard Rohr is that there's always a way to look at something in a non-binary kind of third way. This whole dichotomy that we often use between faith or science, faith or reason, is a false dichotomy in many ways. And I think when people discover that, when I discovered that as a biology major who was now going to seminary, it can be a liberating thing to say this is not an either or.
Let me ask you one more question with relation to the call.
Yeah.
So you said your parents knew all along, and that means that there's a story behind that. I mean, did you grow up in the church? Did you have relatives who are clergy? How are you formed to arrive at this place?
Right, that's a great question. So my parents, deeply devout Christians. My mom, really devout Roman Catholic, as most Filipinos growing up in the Philippines are. My dad, growing up a Protestant Christian, both of them really wanting to raise me in the faith. And ironically, I was more formed by my conservative evangelical Christian school that they put me in for 12 years than I was by the church. I didn't really start going to the church until 10th grade, really. So I was formed because of their intentionality of putting me in a Christian school. But it really wasn't until I started going to a Methodist church that I started to experience, what I now understand as grace, prevenient grace. But I think what they meant by that was that they knew that the faith had become so important to me because it was important to them, that the transition to making Christianity more than just a spiritual thing, but a vocational thing, was not so much a surprise to them. I think, and they knew that I'd gotten 11 rejection letters from medical school. And they knew that my first job out of college was when that same Methodist church hired me to start their contemporary worship service in 1994. And they'd heard me preach for a full year before I told them that news. So they were not surprised. In some ways, they are as responsible for my call as anybody else. They did this to me.
Yeah, you can blame them. I want to shift to the next question, which is around. I jokingly say this is to prove that you're a Christian. The good old evangelical. What is your favorite memory verse? What is your favorite book of the Bible? Or what's your favorite biblical story in general? We'd just love to hear that.
Yeah. I think my favorite story in the Bible is Elijah on Mount Horeb. That story where Elijah's at the end of his rope. He's got a death sentence over his head. He's tired. And he literally tells God, I've had enough. Take my life. I'm all alone. He's poured out everything that he has for God and done everything that God's wanted him to do. And then there's this incredible interchange between Elijah and God, where God doesn't show up right away. And then when things start happening where Elijah starts thinking that it's God, because God's shown up in that way before, in the earthquake, in the wind, and the fire, all of the reliable ways that God had shown up in the past, God was not in. There was a moment of, for Elijah, profound theological expansion, which means God was about to show up in a different way, but in a way that Elijah needed in that moment. And so it's that great story of Elijah in the cave hearing that still small voice. I've lived with that story in my toughest times in college. It was profoundly helpful to me in seminary as I was wrestling with what it meant to be a minister, and with all sorts of, personal changes and the things that I was growing through. That story's always been helpful to me, that the ways that God has shown up for me in the past are not necessarily the ways God is always going to show up to me. There are some ways, that place in Pass the Grill has been a reliable way. But the moment I expect, again, back to expectation, the moment I expect or almost demand God to show up in my terms, just because it's happened that way in the past, is the moment I look for God in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, and God is free to not show up in those ways so that I can be ready to experience God in a new way. So that's my favorite story. I'd say my favorite book, at least in the Old Testament, is Ecclesiastes. I think for the last 10 years, I've really loved that book because it's unafraid to tell it like it is. No sugarcoating.
That's not a sugar-coated book right there.
No, the harsh realities of life. And I think there's something liberating about just naming reality for the way it is. And I put those stories, the Horeb story and the Ecclesiastes story, kind of in juxtaposition, because I think it's good to name reality for the way it is. Sometimes it feels like vanity of vanities. All is vanity. It's all just a whisper and just a breath. And at the same time, that very same breath can be the still small voice that God is speaking novelty and hope into our situation. So I don't know why they're both Old Testament stories. It feels to me like as a Christian person, there ought to be some Jesus in there, but at least those two stories rise to the top. So,
well, we'll acknowledge at least you're a good Hebrew.
Yeah, I love it.
I do have a question that arises from that story from Elijah, is that you made the comment, I think it's just a great way of stating it, is that in the earthquake, the fire, and the wind, those are the ways we expect God to show up. And in our current climate and situation, what are the ways God is showing up that or at least how are we being transformed from the things we expect God to show up into a possible new day or new opportunities to hear God's voice?
Well, I think God will always reliably show up in love, in acts of love, in embodied love. The heart of the Christian conviction is incarnation. So God will always show up when people embody love and service for one another, when they care enough about someone else's well-being that they will take their own precautions, that they will shelter at home, that they will do the things not just for themselves, but for other people. I think that's God showing up. I think there's still lots of space for God to show up in new ways. And I think that's part of the task for the church today, is to be like a docent in a gallery and say, oh, here, look at this. God is doing this in a new way. We've never seen this before. Or this reminds us of this time when God did this in the past, and to help people see how God is moving in new ways too.
Yeah, thank you for that. Kind of feeding off of that, and also relate to the times when we find ourselves a season of virus and fear, both physically but also economic fear, and then to top it all off, we've been through a whole series of years where we're uncertain about our political systems, or even whether we come down to the economy or economics, even if the way we've done business in the past will still be the way we do it in the future. I mean, there's so much kind of coming in all at once. And then you just have a virus can shut down the whole world for a couple of months, you know, that top it off. So in light of that, how do you, I mean, what does hope mean to you? And you could probably feed off of that and spiral into my last question, which is, and what is your hope for the church as we move into the future?
So in a nutshell, hope for me means being able to take the step that God has given to us, one step at a time, without worrying about what step 2 or step 3 will be. Oftentimes when we worry about something that's down the road, and we are concerned about how to get from here to the future, and we don't see it. And really, hope means just taking the next step that God has illuminated for us in the short term and be faithful to that next step, trusting that when it's time to take step 2, God will show us what step 2 is. I've had to adopt that the hard way in my own personal life. I find it very relevant to the way we're all leading our churches right now. We're all itchy to find out what step 5, step 10, and step 15 will look like in terms of what the church will do when this virus is over, or what it will look like. But we can't know that. All we know is what step 1 is. And so we're faithful to that next step.
Well, that is a common recurring theme across all of our conversations, is there's not 10 steps, Magrey.
No, yeah, well, not to disparage the recovery community, because I think there are 10 very valid
steps. There's 12
in certain circles. But no, in a situation like this, you take the step as God illuminates it. You mentioned about how a virus can disrupt all of our economic and political systems and tug at the loose fabrics that were a lot loose to begin with. I always remember that passage where it says, some trust in kings and some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. I also remember what Stanley Hauerwas said in a prayer vigil in Duke Chapel. I don't know if you were there at the time, right after 9/11. I don't think you were there. He offered a prayer of confession, and he said, "Forgive us, Lord, for entrusting to our political leaders, entrusting to our governments, entrusting to our military might, a kind of security that only can come from you." And I think about that prayer whenever there's a major news headline that's just sort of shaking us to the core. What does it point out in us of misplaced security to begin with? I think, and I think, we trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Yeah, that's a great word. They Stanley was one of my professors at Duke, and he was constantly challenging us on the issues of allegiance. Yeah. And I get to thinking about what you hear through the media, or even just around the water cooler, how everybody is focusing their attention on what the government is able to do to save us.
Right.
And the fall of the modern era, which came about to the rise of post-modernity in the 60s, or late 50s, early 60s, was this idea that everybody believed that science would figure everything out for us, and it didn't. There's still no cure for cancer. There's still, now we don't have a cure for a new virus.
Right.
Something new is always going to be of a pestilence to us, and you really get to kind of hold a magnifying glass up against those conversations and say, this is the wrong conversation to have.
Yeah.
The government's not going to save you. Even the next person we elect might be great, but they're gone in 4 years, and we all die, so the next wicked king might be on the horizon, or the next great king. But, the Lord our God is consistent throughout the ages in God's presence with us through it all. And I think that's tough sometimes for people to grasp, that God is with us in good and bad.
Wow. Yeah. I will tell you this, for your Cornerstone family who's watching this, this is one of the reasons why your pastor is such a gift to you, because Roy, you've got just this profoundly deep well of wisdom that draws from such a rich amount of reading and reflecting that you've done, and it comes across just so earnestly and genuinely. And I know that whenever we get our group together, you're always right in the mix and leading us with such profound words. So thank you for that.
Well, I'll pay you later for those comments. I appreciate it.
Well, just come on up and let's have some barbecue in Tampa.
We'll go back to BJ. As a matter of fact, I should probably have BJ's pay us for this podcast.
Yeah, man.
The BJ's Alabama Barbecue.
BJ's Southern Alabama Barbecue on Dale Mabrey, right here in South Tampa.
Right. Sponsoring deck discussions. So the last question about hope is, okay, the one step at a time, one day at a time, see where God illuminates the path in front of us. A holy and patience, which it requires discernment, which is, I think, one of the beauties of being Methodist, is that we've been given these great tools of, tradition and scripture and reason, experience, and then, of course, the stages of grace, or the way of grace, which is a journey, not you don't arrive, right? It's just you're continually on this journey. So what is your hope for the church and as we move into the future?
Yeah, boy, this is an anxious time, but this may be one of the most significant windows of opportunity for the church that we will see in our lifetimes. And what I mean by that is, this is more than just a challenge to what we do as a church. This can be one of those defining moments that gets to our identity as a church, what we believe the church is and who it can be. I was thinking about this earlier today because I knew you were going to ask me this question, that when I think about my own life, just my own timeline, personal history, there are moments when the most significant moments to me are the ones where I've had to recalibrate my identity. Not just what I do, but who I am. I mean, there's a difference between changes in modality and changes in identity. That's why getting married is more significant than graduating from high school, because graduating from high school is an achievement, but getting married gets to the core of who you now are. That's why having a child is more significant than your first job. They're both important, but having a child changes who you are, rather than just what you do for a living. So right now we're in modality mode as a church. How can we move to virtual? How can we create discipleship systems that are online? The modality stuff. But the great opportunity for us as a church is when we start seizing it as an identity question. Who can we really be in a world that has been changing all along, but that we haven't been willing to change? There are some incontrovertible aspects of being the church that will not change. We have to be rooted in our tradition. We're anchored in our beliefs in the Christian faith. But when it comes to who we are as a church, are we more than our buildings? Are we more than just our programs and ministries? What does it mean to reclaim a meaningful message to the culture? What is our message, and who are we in this rapidly changing world? These are identity questions, and I think there's a hunger for it. We talked about Richard Rohr and non-binary thinking and embracing of reason. This is all part of what we get to do to recalibrate the identity of the Christian faith, to reach out to people who are on the theological margins, who are hungry, who are spiritually hungry for this. It's exciting in some ways. It's easy to get bogged down in the anxiety of it. I think the anxiety of it comes when we're focused on the modality decisions of how to do the work of the church right now, when things are so unsettled. But when you shift it to think about, we get to help recreate who the church is by the work of the Spirit, a new kind of Pentecost, that anxiety gets replaced with hope, which I think is kind of exciting.
That's very exciting. I That did made little hairs rise up on my neck there when you were talking about that. Last interview I had with Steve, we talked about how in a lot of the language that's being used in our society right now is who's essential and who's not essential. And we were joking about it. It's amazing how now all the sports people don't have anything to do. Obviously, the highest paid people in the country are non-essential, just so you know. And yet in the church, I think what I hear you saying, and I probably could break it out a little bit more, is you're saying there's things we can identify that are essential, they transcend time and culture. Matter of fact, people are probably hungry for those things.
Absolutely.
And yet we're seeing things get peeled right away, or carpets ripped right out from under us that aren't essential, but that we thought were.
Right.
So,
right.
So talk maybe a little more about that.
I think as Christian people, we will always be Christ-centered. We will always be rooted in the Scriptures. For us as United Methodists, we'll always be rooted in a wonderful tradition of grace and our understanding of how God works. Those are the reality of the resurrection. In many ways, those are pieces that define who we are throughout time. But just as, like I said, just as you change your identity when you get married, or when you have a child, or whatever it is, or when you lose a loved one, moments of crisis like this really get us to expand who we are and who we think we need to be for a changing world. And I don't know what the outcome of this will be. I really don't. But that's why it gets back to this hope thing. You take the next step when it's given to us, and then we take the next step after that. And listen to the voices on the fringe. I think that's the important thing. Listen to the margins. Because in many ways, the people who are in the margins are the prophetic witnesses telling us where we need to go and where we need to reach. The people who have either left the church because they've been harmed, or the people who've been skeptical of the church and never been a part of it. There's something about Matthew 25 that tells us that if we want to find Jesus, we find it in the people where we would least expect to find him. And the prophetic witnesses are the voices in the margins. They're the ones who are pushing us to become something that we can be, but are refusing to be. And they're the ones with that still small voice of God who are telling us God is pushing us in a way that God has not pushed us before. So.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Magrey, thank you so much for joining me for a deck discussion.
You're a jewel, man. What a great guy.
Hyde Park, and I know thousands from Hyde Park will be watching this, so they need to know what a gift you are to them, and that if there was somebody to lead Hyde Park into this new future that God has, you are the guy. Oh. And they need to know that you have a support system like they can't even comprehend, and that your depth of Scripture, understanding Scripture and theological conversation is just enormous, and a gift to anybody that comes your way. So thank you, my brother, for sharing a little bit with Cornerstone, and of course this will be on Facebook, so everybody else who tunes in will be able to get a little bit of the gift of Magrey deVega here today.
Well, you're a gift to me, brother, as well as the other 8 guys. Love you.
Love you too.